Good evening and welcome back to my channel. I'm your loyal Hufflepuff, and today we'll be continuing our reading in Goosebumps. This particular book is the second book in a series. The title of this one is Stay Out of the Basement. There is a TV show that has a two-part episode based off of this book, and I've watched some of it earlier, and I can tell with comparison-wise how accurate it is. But I hope you all are enjoying this special Halloween series, and I hope to see all your likes and comments down below. And if you are enjoying this series, please subscribe and like my videos. Without further ado, let us continue reading in Goosebumps, Stay Out of the Basement. Margaret swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry as cotton. She suddenly realized she was squeezing the side of the counter so tightly. Her hand ached, forcing herself to loosen her grip. She stared down at the half-empty plant food bag, which she had dropped onto the floor. She felt sick. She couldn't get the disgusting picture out of her mind. How could her dad eat mud? He didn't just eat it, she realized. He shoveled it into his mouth and gulped it down. As if he liked it. As if he needed it. Eating the plant food had to be part of his experiments, Margaret told herself. But what kind of experiments? What was he trying to prove with those strange plants he was growing? The stuff inside the bag smelled sour, like fertilizer. Margaret took a deep breath and held it. She suddenly felt sick to her stomach, staring at the bag. She couldn't help but imagine what the disgusting muck inside tastes like. Oh, she nearly gagged. How could her father shove this horrid stuff into his mouth? Still holding her breath, she grabbed the nearly empty bag, wadded it up, and tossed it back into the trash. She started to turn away from the counter when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Margaret uttered a silent cry and spun around. Casey! I'm home, he said, grinning at her. What's for lunch? Later, after making him a peanut butter sandwich, she told Casey what she had seen. Casey laughed. It is funny, she said. It isn't funny, she said crossly. Our own dad was eating dirt. Casey laughed again. For some reason, it struck him funny. Margaret punched him hard on the shoulder, so hard that he dropped his sandwich. Sorry, she said quickly. But I don't see what you're laughing at. It's sick. There's something wrong with Dad. Something really wrong. Maybe he just had a craving for plant food. Casey cracked, still not taking her seriously. You know, like you get a craving for those honey roasted peanuts. That's different, Margaret snapped. Eating dirt is disgusting. Why won't you admit it? But before Casey could reply, Margaret continued, letting all of her unhappiness out at once. Don't you see? Dad has changed a lot. Even since Mom has been gone. He spends even more time in the basement. That's because Mom isn't around, Casey interrupted. And he's so quiet all the time and so cold to us, Margaret continued, ignoring him. He hardly says a word to us. He used to kid around all the time and ask us about our homework. He never says a human word. He never calls me princess or fatso the way he used to. He never... You hate those names, fatso, Casey said, giggling with a mouthful of peanut butter. I know, Margaret said impatiently. That's just an example. So what are you trying to say? Casey asked. That Dad is out of his tree? That he's gone totally bananas? I don't know, Margaret answered in frustration, watching him gulp down that disgusting plant food. I had this horrible thought that he's turning into a plant. Casey jumped up, causing his chair to scrape back across the floor. He began staggering around the kitchen, zombie-like, his eyes closed, his arms stretched out stiffly in front of him. "I am the incredible plant man," he declared, trying to make his voice sound bold and deep. "Not funny," Margaret insisted, crossing her arms over her chest, refusing to be amused. "Plant man versus weed woman," Casey declared, staggering toward Margaret. "Not funny," she repeated. He bumped into the counter, banging his knee. "Ow!" "Serves you right," Margaret said. "Plant man kills," he cried, and rushed at her. He ran it right into her, using his head as a battering ram against her shoulder. "Casey, will you stop it?" she screamed. "Give me a break." Okay, he backed off. "If you do me one favor." "What favor?" Margaret asked, rolling her eyes. "Make me another sandwich." Monday afternoon, after school, Margaret, Casey, and Diane were tossing a frisbee back and forth in Diane's backyard. It was a warm, breezy day, and the sky dotted with small, puffy white clouds. Diane tossed the disc high. It sailed over Casey's head into the row of fragrant lemon trees that stretched from behind the clapboard garage. Casey went running after it and tripped over an in-ground sprinkler that poked up just an inch above the lawn. Both girls laughed. Casey, on the run, flung the frisbee toward Margaret. She reached for it, but the breeze sent it sailing from her hand. "What's it like to have a mad scientist for a dad?" Diane asked suddenly. "What?" Margaret wasn't sure she heard right. "Don't just stand there, throw it." Sorry. I'm adjusting here. Okay. Let's see here. What? Let's see. Okay. "Don't just stand there, throw it," Casey urged beside the garage. Margaret tossed the frisbee high in the air in her brother's general direction. He liked to run and make diving catches. "Just because he's doing strange experiments doesn't mean he's a mad scientist," Margaret said sharply. "Strange is right," Diane said, her expression turning serious. I had a nightmare last night about those gross plants in your basement. They were crying and reaching for me." "Sorry," Margaret said sincerely. I've had nightmares too." "Look out!" Casey cried. He tossed a low one that Diane caught around her ankles. Mad scientist, Margaret thought. Mad scientist. Mad scientist. The words kept repeating in her mind. Mad scientists were only in the movies, right? "My dad was talking about your dad the other night," Diane said, flipping the disc to Casey. "You didn't tell him about going down in the basement, did you?" Margaret asked anxiously. "No," Diane replied, shaking her head. "Hey, are those lemons ripe?" Casey asked, pointing at one of the low trees. "Why don't you suck one to find out?" Margaret snapped, annoyed that he kept interrupting. "Why don't you?" he predictably shot back. "My dad said that your dad was fired from Polytech because his experiments got out of control, and he wouldn't stop them," Diane confided. She ran along the smooth, closely cropped grass, chasing down the frisbee. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "The university told him he had to stop whatever it was he was doing, and he refused. He said he couldn't stop. At least that's what my dad heard from a guy who came into the sales room." Margaret hadn't heard this story. It made her feel bad, but she thought it was probably true. "Something really bad happened in your dad's lab," Diane continued. "Someone got really hurt or killed or something." That's not true, Margaret insisted. We would have heard if that happened. Yeah, probably, Diane admitted. But my dad said your dad was fired because he refused to stop his experiments. Well, that doesn't make him a mad scientist, Margaret said defensively. She suddenly felt she had to stick up for her father. She wasn't sure why. I'm just telling you what I heard, Diane said, brusquely tossing back her red hair. You don't have to bite my head off. They played for a few more minutes. Diane changed the subject and talked about some kids they knew who were 11, but were going steady. They talked about school for a while. Time to go, Margaret called to Casey. He picked the frisbee up from the lawn and came running over. Call you later, Margaret told Diane, giving her a little wave. Then she and Casey began to jog home, cutting through familiar backyards. We need a lemon tree, Casey said as they slowed to a walk. They're cool. Oh yeah, Margaret replied sarcastically. That's just what we needed at our house. Another plant. As they stepped through the hedges into their backyard, they were both surprised to see their dad. He was standing at the rose trellis examining clusters of pink roses. Hey, Dad, Casey called. Catch! He tossed the frisbee to his father. Dr. Brewer turned around a little too slowly. The frisbee glanced off his head, knocking the Dodger's cap off. His mouth opened wide in surprise. His mouth opened wide in surprise. He raised his hands to cover his head, but it was too late. Margaret and Casey both shrieked in surprise as they saw his head. At first, Margaret thought her father's hair had turned green, but then she clearly saw it wasn't hair on his scalp. His hair was gone. It had all fallen out. In place of hair, Dr. Brewer had bright green leaves sprouting from his head. That was the end of chapter 8. Now we begin chapter 9. Kids, it's okay, Dr. Brewer called. He bent down, quickly picked up the baseball cap, and replaced it on his head. A crow flew low overhead, cawing loudly. Margaret raised her eyes to follow the bird, but the sight of the hideous leaves sprouting from her father's head wouldn't go away. Her whole head began to itch as she imagined what it must feel like to have leaves uncurling from your scalp. It's okay, really, Dr. Brewer repeated, hurrying over to them. But Dad, your head, Casey stammered. He suddenly looked very pale. Margaret felt sick. She kept swallowing hard, trying to ride out the waves of nausea. Come here, you two, their father said softly, putting an arm around each of their shoulders. Let's sit down in the shade over there and have a talk. I spoke to your mom on the phone this morning. She told me you're upset about my work. Your head, it's all green, Casey repeated. I know, Dr. Brewer said, smiling. That's why I put on the cap. I didn't want you to worry. He led them to the shade of the tall hedges that ran along the garage, and they sat down on the grass. I guess you two think your dad has gotten pretty weird, huh? He stared into Margaret's eyes. Feeling uncomfortable, she looked away. Cawing frantically, the crow flew over again, heading in the other direction. Margaret, you haven't said a word, her father said, squeezing her hand tenderly between his. What's wrong? What do you want to say to me? Margaret sighed and still avoided her father's glance. Come on, tell us. Why do you have leaves growing out of your head? She asked bluntly. It's a side effect, he told her, continuing to hold her hand. It's only temporary. It'll go away soon, and my hair will grow back. But how did it happen? Casey asked, staring at his father's Dodgers cap. A few green leaves poked out from under the brim. Maybe you two would feel better if I explained what I'm trying to do down in the basement, Dr. Brewer said, shifting his weight and leaning back on his hands. I've been so wrapped up in my experiments, I haven't had much time to talk to you. You haven't had any time, Margaret corrected him. I'm sorry, he said, lowering his eyes. I really am. But this work I'm doing is so exciting and so difficult. Did you discover a new kind of plant? Casey asked, crossing his legs beneath him. No, I'm trying to build a new kind of plant, Dr. Brewer explained. Huh? Casey exclaimed. Have you ever talked about DNA in school? Their father asked. They shook their heads. Well, it's pretty complicated, he continued. Dr. Brewer thought for a moment. Let me try and put it in simple terms, he said, fiddling with the bandage around his hand. Let's say we took a person who had a very high IQ, real brain power. Like me, Casey interrupted. Casey, shut up, Margaret said edgily. A real brain, like Casey, Dr. Brewer said agreeably. And let's say we were able to isolate the molecule or gene or tiny part of a gene that enabled that person to have such high intelligence. And then let's say we were able to transmit it into other brains. And then this brain power could be passed along from generation to generation. And lots of people would have a high IQ. Do you understand? He looked first at Casey, then at Margaret. Yeah, kind of, Margaret said. You take a good quality from one person and put it into other people. And then they have the good quality too, and they pass it on to their children, and on and on. Very good, Dr. Brewer said, smiling for the first time in weeks. That's what a lot of botanists do with plants. They try to take the fruit-bearing building block from one plant and put it into another. Create a new plant that will bear 5 times as much fruit, or 5 times as much grain, or vegetables. And that's what you're doing? Casey asked. Not exactly, their father said, lowering his voice. I'm doing something a little more unusual. I really don't want to go into detail now, but I'll tell you that what I'm trying to do is build a kind of plant that has never existed and could never exist. I'm trying to build a plant that's part animal. Casey and Margaret stared at their father in surprise. Margaret was the first to speak. You mean you're taking cells from an animal and putting them into a plant? He nodded. I really don't want to say more. You two understand why this must be kept secret. He turned his eyes on Margaret, then Casey, studying their reactions. How do you do it? Margaret asked, thinking hard about everything he had just told them. How do you get these cells from animals to the plant? I'm trying to do it by breaking them down electronically, he answered. I have 2 glass booths connected by a powerful electron generator. You may have seen them when you were snooping around down here. He made a sour face. Yeah, they look like phone booths, Casey said. One phone booth is a sender, and one is a receiver, he explained. I'm trying to send it the right DNA, the right building blocks, from one booth to the other. It's very delicate work. And have you done it? Margaret asked. I've come very close, Dr. Brewer said, a pleased smile crossing his face. The smile lasted only a few seconds. Then his expression thoughtful. He abruptly climbed to his feet. Got to get back to work, he said quietly. See you two later. He started walking across the lawn, taking long strides. But Dad, Margaret called after him. She and Casey climbed to their feet, too. Your head, the leaves, you didn't explain it. She she said as she and her brother hurried to catch up to him. Dr. Brewer shrugged. Nothing to explain, he said curtly. Just a side effect. He adjusted his Dodger's cap. Don't have to worry about it. It's only temporary. Just a side effect. Then he hurried into the house. Casey seemed really pleased by their dad's explanation of what was going on in the basement. Dad's doing really important work, he said, with unusual seriousness. But, as Margaret made her way into the house, she found herself troubled by what her dad had said, and even more troubled by what he hadn't said. Margaret closed the door to her room and laid down on the bed to think about things. Her father hadn't really explained the leaves growing on his head. Just a side effect. Didn't explain much at all. A side effect from what? What actually caused it? What made his hair fall out? When will his hair grow back? It was obvious that he hadn't wanted to discuss it with them. He had certainly hurried back to his basement after telling them it was just a side effect. A side effect. It made Margaret feel sick every time she thought about it. What must it feel like? Green leaves pushing up from your pores? Uncurling against your head? Yuck. Thinking about it made her itch all over. She knew she'd have hideous dreams tonight. She grabbed her pillow and hugged it over her stomach, wrapping her arms tightly around it. There were lots of other questions Casey and I should have asked, she decided. Like, why were the plants moaning down there? Why did some of them sound like they were breathing? Why did that plant grab Casey? What animal was Dad using? Lots of questions. Not to mention the one Margaret wanted to ask most of all. Why were you gulping down that disgusting plant food? But she couldn't ask that one. She couldn't let her dad know she'd been spying on him. She and Casey hadn't really asked any of the questions they wanted answered. They were just so pleased that their father had decided to sit down and talk with them, even for a few minutes. His explanation was really interesting. As far as it went, Margaret decided, and it was good to know that he was close to doing something truly amazing. Something that would make him really famous. But what about the rest of it? A frightening thought entered her mind. Could he have been lying to them? No, she quickly decided. No, Dad wouldn't lie to us. There are just some questions he hasn't answered yet. She was still thinking about all these questions late that night. After dinner, after talking to Diane on the phone for an hour, after homework, after watching a little TV, after going to bed, and she was still puzzling over them. When she heard her father's soft footsteps coming up the carpeted stairs, she sat up in bed. A soft breeze fluttered the curtains across the room. She listened to her father's footsteps pass her room, heard him go into the bathroom, heard the water begin to run into the sink. I've got to ask him, she decided, glancing at the clock. She saw what it was, 2:30 in the morning, but she realized she was wide awake. I've got to ask him about the plant food. Otherwise, it'll drive me crazy. I'll think about it and think about it and think about it. Every time I see him, I'll picture him standing over the sink, shoving handful after handful into his mouth. There's got to be a simple explanation, she told herself, climbing out of bed. There's got to be a logical explanation, and I have to know it. She padded softly down the hall, a sliver of light escaping through the bathroom door, which is slightly ajar. Water still ran into the sink. She heard him cough, then heard him adjust the water. I have to know the answer, she thought. I'll just ask him point blank. She stepped into the narrow triangle of light and peered into the bathroom. He was standing at the sink, leaning over it, his chest bare, his shirt tossed behind him on the floor. He had put the baseball cap on the closed toilet lid, and the leaves covering his head shone brightly under the bathroom light. Margaret held her breath. The leaves were so green, so thick. He didn't notice her. He was concentrating on the bandage on his hand. Using a small scissors, he cut the bandage, then pulled it off. The hand was still bleeding, Margaret saw. Or was it? What was that dripping from the cut on her father's hand? Still holding her breath, she watched him wash it off carefully under the hot water. Then he examined it. His eyes narrowed in concentration. After washing, the cut continued to bleed. Margaret stared hard, trying to better focus her eyes. It couldn't be blood, could it? It couldn't be blood dripping into the sink. It was bright green. She gasped and started to run back to her room. The floor creaked under her footsteps. "Who's there?" Dr. Brewer cried. "Margaret? Casey?" He poked his head into the hallway as Margaret disappeared back into her room. He saw me, she realized, leaping into bed. He saw me, and now he's coming after me. That was the end of chapter 9. Now I get to start chapter 10. Margaret pulled the covers up to her chin. She realized she was trembling, her whole body shaking and chilled. She held her breath and listened. She could still hear water splashing into the bathroom sink, but no footsteps. He isn't coming after me, she told herself, letting out a long, silent sigh. How could I have thought of that? How could I have been so terrified of my own father? Terrified. It was the first time the word had crossed her mind. But sitting there in bed, trembling so violently, holding onto the covers so hard, listening for his approaching footsteps, Margaret realized that she was terrified of her own father. If only Mom were home, she thought. Without thinking, she reached for the phone. She had the idea in her head to call her mother, wake her up, tell her to come home as fast as she could, tell her something terrible was happening to Dad, that he was changing, that he was acting so weird. She glanced at the clock. 2:43. No, she couldn't do that. Her poor mother was having such a terrible time in Tucson trying to care for her sister. Margaret couldn't frighten her like that. Besides, what could she say? How could she explain to her mother how she had become terrified of her own father? Mrs. Brewer would just tell her to calm down, that her father still loved her, that he would never harm her, that he was just caught up in his work. Caught up. He had leaves growing out of his head. He was eating dirt, and his blood was green. Caught up. She heard the water in the sink shut off. She heard the bathroom light being clicked off. Then she heard her father pad slowly to his room at the end of the hall. Margaret relaxed a little, slid down in the bed, loosened her grip on the blankets. She closed her eyes and tried to clear her mind. She tried counting sheep. That never worked. She tried counting to 1,000. At 375, she sat up. Her head throbbed. Her mouth was as dry as cotton. She decided to go downstairs and get a drink of cold water from the refrigerator. I'm going to be a wreck tomorrow, she thought, making her way silently through the hall and down up the stairs. It is tomorrow. What am I going to do? I've got to get to sleep. The kitchen floor creaked beneath her bare feet. The refrigerator motor clicked on noisily, startling her. Be cool, she told herself. You've got to be cool. She had opened the refrigerator and was reaching for the water bottle when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Aye! She cried out and dropped the open bottle onto the floor. Ice cold water puddled around her feet. She kept back, but her feet were soaked. Casey, you scared me, she exclaimed. What are you doing up? What are you doing up? He replied, half asleep, his blond hair matted against his forehead. I couldn't sleep. Help me mop up this water. I didn't spill it, he said, backing away. You mop it up. You made me spill it, Margaret declared. Shrilly, she grabbed a roll of paper towels off the counter and handed him a wad of them. Come on, hurry! They both got down on their knees and, by the light from the refrigerator, began mopping up the cold water. I just keep thinking about things, Casey said, tossing a soaking wad of paper towel onto the counter. That's why I can't sleep. Me too, Margaret said, frowning. She started to say something else, but a sound from the hallway stopped her. It was a plaintive cry, a moan filled with sadness. Margaret gasped and stopped dabbing at the water. What was that? Casey's eyes filled with fear. They heard it again. Such a sad sound, like a plea, a mournful plea. It's coming from the basement, Margaret said. Do you think it's a plant? Casey asked very quietly. Do you think it's one of Dad's plants? Margaret didn't answer. She crouched on her knees, not moving, just listening. Another moan, softer this time, but just as mournful. I don't think Dad told us the truth, she told Casey, staring into his eyes. He looked pale and frightened in the dim refrigerator light. I don't think a tomato plant would make a sound like that. Margaret climbed to her feet, collected the wet clumps of paper towel, and deposited them in the trash can under the sink. Then she closed the refrigerator door, covering the room in darkness. Her hand on Casey's shoulder, she guided him out of the kitchen and through the hall. They stopped at the basement door and listened. Silence now. Casey tried the door. It was locked. Another low moan, sounding very nearby now. It's so human, Casey whispered. Margaret shuddered. What was going on down in the basement? What was really going on? She led the way up the stairs and waited at her doorway until Casey was safely in his room. He gave her a wave, yawning silently, and closed the door behind him. A few seconds later, Margaret was back in her bed, the covers pulled up to her chin despite the warmth of the night. Her mouth was still achingly dry, she realized. She had never managed to get a drink. Somehow she drifted into a restless sleep. Her alarm went off at 7:30. She sat up and thought about school. Then she remembered there was no school for them for the next 2 days because of some kind of teacher's conference. She turned off the clock radio, slumped back onto her pillow, and tried to go back to sleep. But she was awake now. Thoughts of the night before pouring back into her mind, flooding her with fear she had felt just a few hours earlier. She stood up and stretched, and decided to go talk to her father, to confront him first thing, to ask all the questions she wanted to ask. If I don't, he'll disappear down to the basement, and I'll sit around thinking these frightening thoughts all day, she told herself. I don't want to be terrified of my own father. I don't. She pulled a light cotton robe over her pajamas, found her slippers in the cluttered closet, and stepped out into the hallway. It was hot and stuffy in the hall, almost suffocating. Pale morning light filtered down from the skylight overhead. She stopped in front of Casey's room. wondering if she should wake him so that he could ask their father questions too. No, she decided, the poor guy was up half the night. I'll let him sleep. Taking a deep breath, she walked the rest of the hall and stopped at her parents' bedroom. The door was open. Dad? No reply. Dad, are you up? She stepped into the room. Dad? He didn't seem to be there. The air in here was heavy and smelled strangely sour. The curtains were drawn. The bedclothes were rumpled and tossed down at the foot of the bed. Margaret took a few more steps toward the bed. Dad? No, she had missed him. He was probably already locked in his basement workroom, she realized unhappily. He must have gotten up very early and... What was that in the bed? Margaret clicked on a dresser lamp and stepped up beside the bed. Oh no, she cried, raising her hands to her face in horror. The bedsheet was covered with a thick layer of dirt, clumps of dirt. Margaret stared down at it, not breathing, not moving. The dirt was black and appeared to be moist, and the dirt was moving. Moving? It can't be, Margaret thought. That's impossible. She leaned down to take a closer look at the layer of dirt. No, the dirt wasn't moving. The dirt was filled with dozens of moving insects, and long, brown earthworms, all crawling through the wet, black clumps that lined her father's bed. That's the end of chapter 10. Now we start chapter 11. Casey didn't come downstairs until 10:30, before his arrival. Margaret had made herself breakfast, managed to pull on jeans and a t-shirt, and talked to Diane on the phone for half an hour, and had spent the rest of the time pacing back and forth in the living room, trying to decide what to do. Desperate to talk to her dad, she had banged a few times on the basement door, timidly at first and then loudly, but he either couldn't hear her or chose not to. He didn't respond. When Casey finally emerged, she poured him a tall glass of orange juice and led him out to the backyard to talk. It was a hazy day, the sky mostly yellow, the air already stifling hot even though the sun was still hovering low over the hills. Walking toward the block of green shade cast by the hedges, she told her brother about their dad's green blood and about the insect-filled dirt in his bed. Casey stood open-mouthed, holding the glass of orange juice in front of him, untouched. He stared at Margaret and didn't say anything for a very long time. Finally, he set the orange juice down on the lawn and said, "What should we do?" in a voice just above a whisper. Margaret shrugged. "I wish Mom could call. Would you tell her everything?" Casey asked, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his baggy shorts. "I guess," Margaret said. "I don't know if she'd believe it but it's so scary," Casey said. "I mean, he's our dad. We've known him our whole lives. I mean..." "I know," Margaret said, "but he's not the same. Maybe he can explain it all," Casey said thoughtfully. "Maybe there's a good reason for everything. You know, like the leaves on his head?" We asked about that, Margaret reminded her brother. "He just said it was a side effect. Not much of an explanation." Casey nodded, but didn't reply. "I told some of it to Diane," Margaret admitted. Casey looked up at her in surprise. "Well, I had to tell somebody," she snapped edgily. "Diane thought I should call the police." "Huh?" Casey shook his head. "Dad hasn't done anything wrong, has he?" "What would the police do?" "I know," Margaret replied. "That's what I told Diane." but she said there's got to be some kind of law against being a mad scientist. Dad isn't a mad scientist, Casey said angrily. That's stupid. He's just. Just what? Margaret thought. What is he? A few hours later, they were still on the backyard, trying to figure out what to do, when the kitchen door opened and their father called them to come in. Margaret looked at Casey in surprise. I don't believe it. He came upstairs. Maybe we can talk to him, Casey said. They both raced into the kitchen. Dr. Brewer, his Dodgers cap in place, flashed them a smile as he set two soup bowls down on the table. Hi, he said brightly. Lunchtime. Huh? You made lunch? Casey exclaimed, unable to control his astonishment. Dad, we've got to talk, Margaret said seriously. Afraid I don't have much time, he said, avoiding her stare. Sit down. Try this new dish. I want to see if you like it. Margaret and Casey obediently took their places at the table. What is this stuff? Casey cried. The two bowls were filled with a green, pulpy substance. It looks like green mashed potatoes, Casey said, making a face. It's something different, Dr. Brewer said mysteriously, standing over them at the head of the table. Go ahead, taste it. I'll bet you'll be surprised. Dad, you've never made lunch for us before, Margaret said, trying to keep the suspicion out of her voice. I just wanted to try this, he said, his smile fading. You're my guinea pigs. We have some things we want to ask you, Margaret said, lifting her spoon, but not eating the green mess. Your mother called this morning, their father said. When? Margaret asked eagerly. Just a short while ago. I guess you were outside and didn't hear the phone ring. What did she say? Casey asked, staring down at the bowl in front of him. Aunt Eleanor's doing better. She's been moved out of intensive care. Your mom may be able to come home soon. Great! Margaret and Casey cried in unison. Eat, Dr. Brewer instructed, pointing to the bowls. Aren't you going to have some? Casey asked, rolling his spoon around in his fingers. No, their father replied quickly. I already ate. He leaned with both hands against the tabletop. Margaret saw that his cut hand was freshly bandaged. Dad, last night, she started, but he cut her off. Eat, will you? Try it. But what is it? Casey demanded, whining. It doesn't smell too good. I think you'll like the taste, Dr. Brewer insisted impatiently. It should taste very sweet. He stared at them, urging them to eat the green stuff, staring into the bowl at the mysterious substance. Excuse me. Margaret was suddenly frozen with fear. He's too eager for us to eat this, she thought, glancing up at her brother. He's too desperate. He's never made lunch before. Why did he make this? And why won't he tell us what it is? What's going on here? She wondered. And Casey's expression revealed that he was wondering the same thing. Is Dad trying to do something to us? Is this green stuff going to change us or hurt us or make us grow leaves too? What crazy thoughts, Margaret realized, but she also realized she was terrified of whatever this stuff was he was trying to feed them. What's the matter with you two? Their father cried impatiently. He raised his hand in an eating gesture. Pick up your spoons. Come on. What are you waiting for? Margaret and Casey raised their spoons and dropped them into the soft green substance. but they didn't raise the spoons to their mouths. They couldn't. Eat, eat, Dr. Brewer screamed, pounding the table with his good hand. What are you waiting for? Eat your lunch. Go ahead, eat it. He's giving us no choice, Margaret thought. Her hand was trembling as she reluctantly raised the spoon to her mouth. That was the end of chapter 11. We're currently at chapter 12. Okay. We are 9 chapters away from finishing the book. I think we've got time to do one more chapter, I think. Maybe a chapter or two. Maybe. We'll see. Go ahead. You'll like it, Dr. Brewer insisted, leaning over the table. Casey watched as Margaret raised the spoon to her lips. The doorbell rang. Who could that be? Dr. Brewer asked, very annoyed at the interruption. I'll be right back, kids. He lumbered out to the front hall. Saved by the bell, Margaret said, dropping the spoon back into the bowl with a sinking plop. This stuff is disgusting, Casey whispered. It's some kind of plant food or something. Yuck. Quick, Margaret said, jumping up and grabbing the 2 bowls. Help me. They rushed to the sink, pulled out the wastebasket, and scooped the contents of both bowls into the garbage. Then they carried both bowls back to the table and set them down beside the spoons. Let's go see who's at the door, Casey said. They crept into the hall in time to see the man carrying a black briefcase step into the front entranceway and greet their father with a short handshake. The man had a tanned, bald head and was wearing large blue lens sunglasses. He had a brown mustache and was wearing a navy blue suit with a red and white striped tie. Mr. Martinez, their father exclaimed. What a surprise! That's Dad's old boss from Polytech, Margaret whispered to Casey. I know, Casey replied peevishly. I said weeks ago I'd come check up on how your work is coming along, Martinez said, sniffing the air for some reason. Wellington gave me a lift. My car is in the garage for a change. Well, I'm not really ready, Dr. Brewer stammered, looking very uncomfortable, even from Margaret's vantage point behind him. I wasn't expecting anyone. I mean, I don't think this is a good time. No problem. I'll just take a quick look, Martinez said, putting a hand on Dr. Brewer's shoulder, as if to claim him. I've always been so interested in your work. You know that. And you know that it wasn't my idea to let you go. The board forced me. They gave me no choice. But I'm not giving up on you. I promise you that. Come on, let's see what kind of progress you're making. Well, Dr. Brewer couldn't hide his displeasure at Mr. Martinez's surprise appearance. He scowled and tried to block the path to the basement steps. At least it seemed that way to Margaret, who watched silently beside her brother. Mr. Martinez stepped past Dr. Brewer and pulled open the basement door. Hi, guys. Mr. Martinez gave the 2 kids a wave, hoisting his briefcase as if it weighed 2 tons. Their father looked surprised to see them there. Did you kids finish your lunch? Yeah, it was pretty good, Casey lied. The answer seemed to please Dr. Brewer, adjusting the brim of his Dodgers cap. He followed Mr. Martinez into the basement, carefully closing and locking the door behind him. Maybe he'll give Dad his job back, Casey said, walking back into the kitchen. He pulled open the refrigerator to look for something for lunch. Don't be stupid, Margaret said, reaching over to pull out a container of egg salad. If Dad really is growing plants that are part animal, he'll be famous. He won't need a job. Yeah, I guess, Casey said thoughtfully. Is that all there is? Just egg salad? I'll make you a sandwich, Margaret offered. I'm not really hungry, Casey replied. That green stuff made me sick. Why do you think he wanted us to eat it? I don't know, Margaret said. She put her hand on Casey's slender shoulder. I'm really scared, Casey. I wish Mom were here. Me too, he said quietly. Margaret put the egg salad back into the refrigerator. She closed the door, then leaned her hot forehead against it. Casey, what? Do you think Dad is telling us the truth? About what? About anything? I don't know, Casey said, shaking his head. Then his expression suddenly changed. There's one way to find out, he said, his eyes lighting up. Huh? What do you mean? Margaret pushed herself away from the refrigerator. The first chance we get, the first time Dad is away, Casey whispered, let's go back down into the basement and see for ourselves what Dad is doing. That was the end of chapter 12. And can we do chapter 14? I think we can do chapter 14. Or sorry, chapter 13. That was the end of chapter 12. Now we begin chapter 13. They got their chance the next afternoon when their father emerged from the basement, red metal tool chest in his hand. I promised Mr. Henry next door I'd help him install a new sink in his bathroom, he explained, adjusting his Dodgers cap with his free hand. When are you coming back? Casey asked, glancing at Margaret. Not very subtle, Casey, Margaret thought, rolling her eyes. It shouldn't take more than a couple of hours, Dr. Burrows said. He disappeared out the kitchen door. They watched him cut through the hedges in the backyard and head to Mr. Henry's back door. It's now or never, Margaret said, glancing doubtfully at Casey. Think we can do this? She tried, and the door locked as usual. No problem, Casey said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Go get a paperclip. I'll show you what my friend Kevin taught me last week. Margaret obediently found a paperclip on her desk and brought it to him. Casey straightened the clip out, then poked it into the lock. In a few seconds, he hummed a triumphant fanfare and pulled the door open. Now you're an expert lockpicker, huh? Your friend Kevin is a good guy to know, Margaret said, shaking her head. Casey grinned and motioned for Margaret to go first. Okay, let's not think about it. Let's just do it, Margaret said, summoning her courage and stepping into the landing. A few seconds later, they were in the basement, knowing a little of what to expect down here. Down here didn't make it any less frightening. They were hit immediately by a blast of steamy hot air. The air, Margaret realized, was so wet, so thick, that droplets immediately clung to her skin. Squinting against the sudden bright light, they stopped in the doorway to the plant room. The plants seemed taller, thicker, more plentiful than the first time they had ventured down there. Long, sinewy tendrils drooped from thick yellow stalks. Broad green and yellow leaves bobbed and trembled, shimmering under the white light. Leaves slapped against each other, making a soft, wet sound. A fat tomato plopped to the ground. Everything seemed to shimmer. The plants all seemed to quiver expectantly. They weren't standing still. They seemed to be reaching up, reaching out, quaking with energy as they grew. Long brown tendrils snaked along the dirt, wrapping themselves around other plants around each other. A bushy fern had grown to the ceiling, curved, and started its way back down again. Wow, Casey cried, impressed with this trembling, glistening jungle. Are all these plants really brand new? I guess so, Margaret said softly. They look prehistoric. They heard breathing sounds, loud sighing, a low moan coming from the direction of the supply closet against the wall. A tendril suddenly swung out from a long stalk. Margaret pulled Casey back. Look out! Don't get too close, she warned. I know, he said sharply, moving away from her. Don't grab me like that. You scared me. The tendril slid harmlessly to the dirt. Sorry, she said, squeezing his shoulder affectionately. It's just, well, you remember last time. I'll be careful, he said. Margaret shuddered. She heard breathing, steady, quiet breathing. These plants are definitely not normal, she thought. She took a step back, letting her eyes roam over the amazing jungle of slithering, sighing plants. She was still staring at them when she heard Casey's terrified scream. Help! It's got me! It's got me! And that's the end of chapter 13. We're at chapter 14. Yeah, I'd say I'd say hold off until tomorrow night. I think we could probably finish this tomorrow night. We're at chapter 14. So I hope you guys are all enjoying this book. I know it's about an hour, and I think we've got at least 30 minutes left with this book. We're almost done. There's probably less than 40 pages left with this series. I'm looking forward to finishing this book, hopefully either tomorrow or Monday night. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Until then, I'm the Loyal Hufflepuff, and I'll see you all in the next video.